Clark Field, Luzon, October 1944. Even though the Americans controlled the skies, enemy aircraft kept coming. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Morrison felt the vibrations of another wave of P-38 Lightnings roaring overhead as he pressed his palms against the tense corrugated metal of the operations tent. The pilots were showing clear signs of exhaustion after 67 days of combat missions with the 49th Fighter Group. Bloodshot eyes, hands that trembled when they reached for coffee, and the 1,000-yard stares of men who had seen too many friends burn alive. Still, the Japanese kept arriving. From the radar plot, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez reported a new threat, a large formation of at least 200 aircraft approaching from Formosa, closing fast at a range of 250 miles. Morrison checked his watch. October 23, 1944, 8:47 a.m. It was the fourth day of what intelligence officers called Operation Shogo, Japan's desperate attempt to alter the war's course by launching a major offensive against the American invasion of Leyte. For 3 days straight, waves of Japanese planes had attacked American ground forces and the fleet. Morrison's pilots had met them head-on, downing enemy aircraft by the dozens. The killboard outside the tent told the story in chalk. 267 confirmed kills in 72 hours. The 49th Fighter Group alone had destroyed nearly 25% of the enemy aircraft committed to the fight, but the cost was steep. 12 pilots wounded, 18 dead. The survivors relied on black coffee and adrenaline. Morrison asked Major Pete Sullivan, his operations officer, how many planes they could get airborne. Sullivan, already soaked in sweat despite the early hour, replied that 36 P-38s were ready for launch, with another 12 potentially mission-ready within an hour, pending repairs. Morrison nodded solemnly. Damage to wings was becoming more frequent. Bullet holes, cannon fire, and sometimes entire sections of the control surfaces ripped away. Even miracles had limits, but the ground crews kept working them. Morrison ordered all squadron commanders to prepare for launch. Pilots ran toward their planes as the horn echoed across Clark Field. By the time Morrison reached the flight line, Captain Tommy Razor Kowalski was already strapped into his P-38. At 23, Kowalski was a veteran in combat terms, flying missions since Guadalcanal. The nose of his plane bore 19 white kill silhouettes. Over the engine's roar, Morrison called out to him. Kowalski, adjusting his oxygen mask, raised a gloved hand and said he felt chewed up and spit out, but he could still see straight and his hands weren't shaking too badly. Morrison clapped him on the shoulder and told him to stay sharp. With their twin Allison engines growling in harmony, 36 Lightnings lifted off in tight formation. Kowalski's flight of 4 was on Morrison's right wing. As they gained altitude, the jungle-covered mountains of Luzon stretched out beneath them, broken only by the occasional rice paddy or village. From 10,000 feet, the landscape looked peaceful. The illusion lasted 17 minutes. Lieutenant Bobby Chen, flying tail-end Charlie, radioed a warning. Bandits incoming from below, more than 40 enemy fighters at 15,000 feet. Morrison craned his neck toward Manila Bay. Rising from the haze were dark specks that became the distinctive shapes of Nakajima Ki 43 Oscars and Mitsubishi, a 6M0s, their wings gleaming in the morning sun. Morrison calmly ordered his squadrons to dive, bandits below at 2 o'clock. He reminded them to stick with their wingmen and watch their six. The P-38s rolled over and dove toward the enemy. In aerial combat, survival depended on position, speed, and altitude. At first, the Lightnings had all three. The Japanese were still climbing, burning fuel and energy. Each P-38 carried a 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns, and they descended like avenging spirits, opening fire as they closed in. Morrison picked a 0 and led it perfectly, squeezing the trigger. All 5 guns fired at once. The enemy aircraft rolled over and plunged toward the jungle, its canopy exploding in blood and glass. Morrison called out his first kill, Splash 1. The sky erupted into chaos. Planes twisted and turned in every direction, each pilot trying to get behind his opponent long enough to fire. The radio buzzed with chatter, warnings, confirmations, and desperate calls. Someone spotted a Zeke on a teammate's 6. Another pilot claimed an Oscar going down in flames. Someone else shouted for their wingman. Morrison pulled hard on the stick, turning inside a Key 43 that had made the mistake of trying to outmaneuver a Lightning. He could see the Japanese pilot struggling to line up his guns, but the P-38 had superior power. Morrison fired a burst, and the Oscar's engine exploded into flame and oil. He called it Splash 2. After 20 minutes, the surviving Japanese fighters disengaged and fled toward Manila. As the formation came together, Morrison counted 31 P-38s. Lieutenant Chen, whose Lightning he had seen take a direct hit from a 20mm cannon, was among the 5 lost. The young pilot hadn't even had time to call out on the radio. Despite the losses, they had come out ahead. Morrison estimated at least 15, likely more, Japanese aircraft were falling toward the jungle. Once again, the 49th Fighter Group had performed with distinction. Before they could return to patrol altitude, another threat appeared. Captain Kowalski's voice broke over the radio, directing Morrison's attention south. His stomach sank as he saw the next enemy wave. At least 80 aircraft, including Kai 45 Nick fighters, Oscars, Zeros, and a squadron of the deadly new Kai 84 Frank interceptors, rising like a swarm. Morrison immediately called for assistance, requesting support from any available flights. The response was curt and unhelpful. Buzzard Leader reported they were already engaged and couldn't assist. Morrison did the math. 80 fresh enemy fighters against 31 worn-out American aircraft. It wasn't good, but there was no choice. Just 50 miles behind them was the invasion fleet, packed with thousands of American troops. If the Japanese got through, the consequences would be catastrophic. He gave the order to his pilots. They were the only thing standing between the fleet and the enemy. They had to meet the threat head-on, make every shot count, and stick with their wingmen. At 20,000 feet above central Luzon, the two forces clashed. This time, neither side had the advantage of altitude or position. It was pure willpower and skill against desperation and fury. The Japanese came in waves, trying to swamp the smaller American group with numbers. Morrison soon found himself locked in a brutal turning duel with a Key 84 Frank, the most dangerous aircraft he had ever faced. It was faster, more agile, and flown by a determined, talented pilot. For 5 long minutes, the two aircraft twisted around each other, neither able to land a decisive shot. Morrison finally created some distance, reversed his turn, and used his Lightning's superior acceleration to gain the edge. The Japanese pilot couldn't respond in time. Morrison's guns tore through the Frank, sending it burning into the sky. There was no time to celebrate. Lieutenant Dave Parks, a 19-year-old on his 15th mission, was being attacked by a Zero. Morrison tried to warn him, but Parks was too focused on chasing another enemy. The Zero's 20mm cannons ripped into his P-38. Morrison watched in horror as Parks's plane rolled and dove. A white parachute burst from the falling wreckage, but whether Parks would survive or be captured was uncertain. The battle raged on. Morrison kept engaging targets, his ammo counter ticking down. American and Japanese aircraft fell in roughly equal numbers. The radio was filled with short, grim transmissions. Calls for help, cries of injury, desperate orders. Then, finally, the Japanese began to withdraw again, retreating south. After what felt like hours but was likely just 30 minutes, Morrison took inventory. 18 P-38s were still flying. 13 had been lost, including men Morrison had flown beside for months. Yet again, the Americans had won the exchange. Morrison estimated that at least 40 enemy aircraft had been destroyed. Below them, wrecked enemy planes littered the jungle. The air traffic controller's voice came through. Clark Tower requested Morrison's fuel status. He cursed and checked his gauges. Nearly empty. He asked for priority landing for all Reaper flights. The tower cleared all runways and emergency crews stood by. One by one, the battered Lightnings limped back to Clark Field, riddled with holes and running on fumes. Morrison's engines had been hit. The left one trailed oil across his canopy. Captain Kowalski's plane had holes large enough to fit a fist through, and his right engine was dead. The planes landed in trail formation, tires smoking on the pierced steel runway. Before their engines even stopped, ground crews rushed in to start repairs. Morrison emerged from his cockpit drenched in sweat and utterly drained. Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski, his crew chief, was already inspecting the damage. When Morrison asked how bad it was, the sergeant whistled as he checked the left engine. He reported damage to the oil cooler that would have led to engine seizure in 20 minutes. Even worse, a cannon shell had passed through the aileron control rod. Morrison had no idea how he'd managed to stay in control. This mission had been unlike any of the hundreds Morrison had flown before. Despite brutal losses, the Japanese were still throwing everything they had at the Americans. The 49th Fighter Group had likely downed 60 enemy planes in just 3 hours of combat. But they had also lost 18 of their own. Then Staff Sergeant Rodriguez burst from the operations tent with a message in hand. Fleet Intelligence had just reported that 3 more large formations were inbound from Formosa. More than 300 enemy aircraft in total. Morrison felt the weight of exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. More than 3 hours of combat flying behind him, and now another 300 enemy planes were inbound. His remaining pilots were being asked to go up again, facing odds of nearly 20-1. But what choice did they have? Morrison gave the order to refuel and rearm all available aircraft. Every plane that could fly had to go up. He told his team to contact the 475th to see if they could spare pilots, and even to reach out to the Navy at Lingayen Gulf if needed. The next 4 hours over Luzon were filled with desperate combat. Japanese planes came in relentless waves, but any American fighter that could get off the ground was thrown into the fight. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 348th Fighter Group joined in, along with 3 squadrons of P-38s and even a few Navy F-6F Hellcats flown in from offshore carriers. Morrison himself flew so many missions that day he lost count. His Lightning was patched up and sent back into battle 3 separate times. 8 combat sorties would eventually be recorded in his logbook, but in his memory, they all blended together. The constant tension of searching the skies, the brutal suddenness of each engagement, and the sickening feeling when a fellow pilot didn't come back. By late afternoon, the balance began to shift. Although American forces were suffering serious losses, they still had aircraft available. The Japanese, however, were burning through their remaining air force faster than it could be replenished. The waves of incoming enemy planes became smaller and less frequent. Just before sunset on October 23rd, the final battle of the day began. Morrison and a flight of 6 P-38s encountered a group of about 30 Japanese planes over Manila Bay. Many of these were outdated fighters or converted trainers, likely flown by student pilots forced into combat. It wasn't a dogfight so much as a massacre. With no experienced enemy pilots left, the Americans shot down every single plane without losing one of their own. Morrison landed his P-38 for the last time that day as the sun dipped behind Luzon. His aircraft was so damaged that it was later declared beyond economical repair. The left engine barely functioned, and the entire airframe was riddled with holes. He was met by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had the initial casualty reports in hand. The numbers were staggering. American pilots had destroyed over 1,000 Japanese planes in just 4 days of non-stop combat. The 49th Fighter Group alone accounted for 247 confirmed kills, but the cost was immense. Morrison's unit had lost 37 pilots, with 15 more wounded. Of the 48 P-38s that began the operation 4 days earlier, only 12 were still flight ready. Walking past the row of battered planes being prepared for the next day's missions, if there were to be any, Morrison entered the operations tent. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese had committed nearly their entire remaining air force to the defense of the Philippines. Most of it was now scattered across Luzon's jungle floor. Major Sullivan was chalking the last entries onto the killboard. Every inch of the blackboard was filled with tally marks. The final report, 247 enemy aircraft downed by the 49th Fighter Group, with 1,633 destroyed by all American forces in the Philippines. Morrison stared at the numbers, trying to process their meaning. In just 4 days, American pilots had shattered Japan's ability to contest the skies over the Philippines. It was a stunning victory, achieved at terrible cost. Captain Kowalski appeared beside him, his eyes still bright with adrenaline, though his face was lined with fatigue. He remarked that they had shown the enemy what American pilots could do. Morrison gave a slow nod and glanced toward the empty chairs in the pilots' quarters. He thought about those who weren't there to see the victory. Parks, Rodriguez, Williams, Chen. Good pilots. Good men. Kowalski said they had done their job, preventing the Japanese from reaching the invasion fleet. Morrison looked through the tent flap at the sky over Luzon. If Japan had any planes left, someone was already preparing for tomorrow. But tonight, because of the fierce battles fought overhead, American troops and sailors could sleep without fear of an air attack. Morrison thought again of what had been said so many times. They had the skies, and yet the enemy kept coming, until finally they didn't. The following morning confirmed what many had suspected. Japan's air offensive over the Philippines was over. Reconnaissance flights over Formosa and Luzon found only a few damaged aircraft scattered among abandoned airfields. The vast aerial force Japan had thrown into battle had been annihilated. October 23, 1944, would remain etched in the memories of Morrison and the surviving members of the 49th Fighter Group. It was the day American fighter pilots repelled the largest aerial assault in the Pacific War. More than 1,000 Japanese aircraft had fallen from the skies over the Philippines. The victory proved that courage and determination could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. But it also proved that every triumph came at a price far beyond what could be written on a chalkboard. While the Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the end of Japan's strategic air power, the 4 days in October meant something different to those who fought them. They were the days when ordinary men were asked to do the impossible, and somehow did. Eventually, the kill boards were taken down, the damaged planes either scrapped or repaired, and fallen pilots replaced. But the memory of those days lingered, a reminder of what could be achieved when brave men stood firm, willing to give everything for victory. Even though they had the skies, the enemy had continued to arrive, until they didn't.